When we think of Christmas stories, quite a few actually come to mind to a lot of people, such as The Grinch, Rudolph, Charlie Brown, Frosty the Snowman, The Polar Express, etc. A lot of Christmas stories that have been around for so many years that everybody just loves to watch during Christmas time. However, there's one story that has been around for over 2 centuries now, and that is the story of the Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Most people are familiar with the ballet version of the story and the music that goes with it. To say it's a classic is quite an understatement, to say the least. And since Nutcracker falls into public domain, pretty much anybody can use it for its own game by using the composition for their own versions. So much so that we've been seeing so many different adaptations of the actual story, from live action to orchestra from Fantasia to Care Bears and even frickin' Barbie. Which I gotta say, the Barbie version is actually really good in my opinion. However, there is one iteration of this classic tale that we're pretty much gonna be talking about for this review that I gotta say is probably the one that is probably the worst version out of the entire actual story. And that is the Nuttiest Nutcracker. Now, I've actually seen this movie once growing up. I remember actually seeing a preview of this movie from watching one of the Muppets tapes on VHS. Back then, TriStar actually released a lot of the old Muppet movies, and that was when I really discovered that they actually had a preview for this movie from one of the tapes. That was how I really discovered it. Then, as I seen other YouTubers talk about it, and it kind of got me interested and actually really wanted me to rewatch it again, considering that other people really think the same way as how they feel about this movie. I thought to myself, it shouldn't be this bad, since I do remember actually somewhat enjoying this movie for some strange reason, but I actually decided to just rewatch it just recently. I gotta say, after rewatching it, it's definitely up there as one of the worst specials I've ever seen, especially for the story of the Nutcracker. And I thought for sure Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer was probably one of the worst Christmas specials I've ever seen. And if you guys see my review on it, you can obviously tell what I think about that film, as I really think it's not a very good film itself. However, in terms of how I feel about the Nuttiest Nutcracker, which we're going to touch upon my thoughts on it, let's just say I consider that movie as up there as one of the worst Christmas specials up there, and I probably would say it's considered as a cringe fest. What I mean by cringe fest is pretty much this film pretty much doesn't really know what it really is. It kind of suffers from what I would say is identity crisis. Because a lot of what this movie does is that it's pretty much loosely based from the original Nutcracker story. If anything, it tries to do its own thing, and a lot of times it doesn't exactly make a lot of sense. And it's pretty much just really weird and awkward, and just straight up just a film that I would probably say would rub people the wrong way in a lot of bad and inappropriate ways. This film has like so much inappropriate humor, weird humor, sexual windows, just straight up just a film that I probably would say I don't think it's really passable for a kid's film. In a way, I definitely really feel like it should have never been a kid's film, but it even got it G-rated. Now, before I actually jump the gun on why I dislike this film for pretty much a majority of this entire film, I'm pretty much going to explain a little bit of like the basis of how this movie was and its background and how it was made. Now, this film was made in 1999 at a time when computer animation was the hottest thing in the animation industry, all thanks to the success of Toy Story. Now, ever since Pixar came out with Toy Story, every other studio really wanted to jump into the animation industry by making computer animated films, or shows for that matter. And at a time during that decade, there was a lot of different computer animated stuff that came out. Most notably with Reboot, the Donkey Kong Country cartoon, and of course, VeggieTales. Now, this film actually had an interesting development during the time when this film was actually produced. Now, obviously, this film was kind of direct-to-video, obviously. I don't think it actually came out in theaters. Even if it came out in theaters, I wouldn't be surprised if actually it was a big flop. That being said, though, I don't think it came out in theaters. It was more so into direct-to-video. However, in terms of the development of this film, there's actually a huge history background on it that I highly recommend you actually check out Saber Sparks' video on it. He actually goes through huge history and kind of a whole in-depth based on it than I can. So I highly recommend you definitely check out his channel and definitely check out his review on the Nuttiest Nutcracker, as he pretty much goes in depth with the history on it. Now, to simplify the actual background on this film, pretty much it was developed by Dan Kretsch Productions, who pretty much actually was the one that actually worked on this movie and actually directed this movie. He also worked on Everyone's Hero, and he also did some seasons for VeggieTales. And he also kind of developed the little bit of the Pirates Who Don't Do Anything, as he was kind of heavily involved in the production of that film, which I gotta say was actually one of the best VeggieTales films I've ever seen. What's really interesting about this movie, and obviously it kind of correlates to what we were talking about VeggieTales, the characters in this film look very similar to what the VeggieTales characters look like. If anything, they actually could pass off as unused characters from the other VeggieTales specials and films. Pretty much because of the way they look and everything. Yet, in terms of the story of this entire film, which obviously, I gotta say when it comes to the actual film itself, since it is kind of sort of based on the fact that it's supposed to be like an adaptation of the Nutcracker. To be honest with you, this film does not have anything to do with the Nutcracker, as yeah, it sort of has like some characters that may look like it could be passed off as basically the characters from that particular ballet. Yet, like I mentioned before, it pretty much has really nothing to do with the actual story, and it's basically loosely based. The essential plot of it is you have a girl named Marie who's sad about her parents' absence, receives a Nutcracker doll from her uncle, entering a magical world where she teams up with talking nuts and veggies to help the prince defeat the evil Mouse King Reginald, reclaim his kingdom, and get the star on top of the Christmas tree before midnight. That's pretty much kind of what the whole plot of it is, mixed with all the different innuendos and just weird and obscure kind of things that are going on. And to be quite honest with you, when it comes to the plot, it actually does not go anywhere, which is kind of why I feel like when it comes to this adaptation, it just becomes something that it really isn't. It almost feels like it loses track of really what it's supposed to be right in the very beginning. Like, yes, it has this setup where it actually like kind of sets up the whole story for the Nutcracker, which you can tell from like other adaptations. But after that, it doesn't feel like it really knows where the hell it's going. If anything, it kind of feels like all the characters are kind of just singing and screwing around, and then as soon as they go into the world, it's pretty much the same thing. And even when they enter the world, it's just basically just them singing and just kind of screwing around in the majority of the entire film. In a way, that's sort of kind of why I appreciate the Barbie Nutcracker adaptation, because at least with that film, even though, yeah, it's Barbie and it's whatever, but at least with that film, it was very faithful to the adaptation that it was supposed to be. Here, it feels like it's not even supposed to be like that. It feels like it's trying to be its own different thing by mixing it with the name Nutcracker, and that's it. If anything, it felt more like a early version of what Sausage Party is, mixed with VeggieTales. That's kind of where I got it with Nuttiest Nutcracker, because this film feels like it's a lot like that as well. If anything, it kind of felt like it was the early draft of how Sausage Party was before it was actually the initial film. So, as a whole, I would say the story is really just a complete muddled mess. Now that I talked about somewhat of how shitty the story is, let's kind of talk about the animation. Well, the animation, since obviously this is kind of like the early examples of early CGI when studios were kind of just jumping into the industry after Pixar to Toy Story, I gotta say, when it comes to this film's animation, it is not Toy Story. Obviously, this animation does not look really good, and even at the time when the early CGI was kind of just going in, obviously this is not a good example of that, especially when a lot of other works that had CGI are so much better. In fact, even DreamWorks' movies look a lot better than this. Like, Ants itself looks way better than this. That was a film that came out in 1998, and came out a year before this special came out. And what's really bizarre to me is that this film had a budget of $84,000. For that kind of money, it's just weird to me how terrible the animation is. And obviously, they kind of used the budget for a lot of things, especially the voice actors, which we'll get to in a sec. But when it comes to the animation, it's just ridiculously bad. Like, enough where it's almost just cringe and terrible to look at. Like, it basically makes so many other CGI films look way better than this in comparison. Even the character models, which like I mentioned before, is pretty much like unused character designs that they use for VeggieTales, which is really interesting to me considering that they literally look like that, but morphed in with like the tonality of Sausage Party and Food Fight, which is another film that has god-awful animation. Even the human characters, which is Marie and the Prince, they're pretty much stiff in this entire special. They don't exactly show a lot of emotion, they kind of just don't really move around, and they don't exactly feel like they really fit well into the actual film itself. And speaking of the human characters don't really get a lot of screen time in this entire film. Pretty much, yeah, they're in the story and they're obviously in the film for most of like 90% of the film. But really, it's just more so just about the veggies and the nut characters. That's pretty much all they are. They pretty much just come in, they do their shtick, they sing, they pretty much just do all their sexual windows and their lines and everything, and that's pretty much it. They pretty much just have most of the screen time than any of the characters in here, which is really fascinating to me considering that this film pretty much loses everything that's supposed to be about, and that's supposed to be about the Nutcracker. If anything, it doesn't have anything to do with the actual initial story that it's supposed to be. However, that being said though, what do I think about the music in this? Since obviously I just mentioned about the characters and obviously the nut characters, the music in this film is just so out of place. For some reason, the music in here, yeah, even though they use the actual orchestra in the very beginning, but after that, it just becomes everything else. Like, the music just feels so out of place. And the reason I say that is because for most of the music that's featured in this film, most of it's all Christian music. Which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with anybody who's Christian or really likes Christian music itself. But when you have something like Nutcracker, who pretty much has more to do with the orchestra or just the ballet, you would think that they would have the music from that particular piece. But here, they don't even do that. Only in the very beginning, or maybe some small parts in the entire film. for most of it, it's all just gospel music, and that's about it. Which is nothing wrong with that, but I feel like for something like this, they don't seem to be something that you would want to put in there, especially for an old Christmas classic like the Nutcracker. If anything, it feels like I'm watching a traditional old school music video where it shows all the characters just singing and doing their shtick throughout the entire thing, and if anything, it has absolutely no substance to it. I talked about most of the majority of this entire movie, what I think about the characters, which is pretty much the cherry on the cake at this point. I'm going to be honest with you, I find the characters in this entire special, they absolutely mean no purpose to the plot, which is really saying something considering that obviously this is the Nutcracker and it's supposed to have at least characters that people know, or at least have somewhat of an idea of what they are based on what they've seen from the actual adaptations that it's been based on. I'll be honest with you, when it comes to the characters in the special, they're pretty uninteresting, they don't mean anything to the plot, and they're just straight up just either awkward, weird, and just straight up unlikable. An example of this is Marie. Marie throughout the entire special is pretty much a whiny bitch for the entire special. And the reason why I say that is because the whole time there's just not really a lot of things that are really positive about her, especially when we get through the entire special. There's really nothing really else that really feels like it makes her really interesting. And if anything, she just comes off really whiny and just straight up just unlikable, especially when things don't go her way. I do not fault the voice actress that actually played this character, considering that she's actually voiced by Debbie Derryberry, who actually does the role of Jimmy Neutron, which I'm actually a big fan of her work in that show, and other stuff that she's done in the past. I would say that it's the character that they gave her that pretty much makes the performance really flat. However, I do not fault the voice actress that was involved in it, and that goes the same with the rest of the voice actors that were in it as well, since this movie had really good voice actors in it, and I really like most of the voice cast they got. I feel it has more to do with the writing in this special that really just comes off, each performance becomes flat, and each character just comes off completely boring, uninteresting, and just straight up just disturbing. And speaking of disturbing, Reginald the Mouse King is pretty much a straight up just a disturbing character as a whole. Mainly because of the fact that, yeah, he's supposed to be the villain in this entire story, which obviously the Mouse King in most of the Nutcracker adaptations is supposed to be the villain. But in here, I wouldn't really say he's more of a villain, since obviously he gets redeemed in the end. But again, it feels like he's just straight up just doesn't really exactly do anything for the plot. Even though he's trying to pretty much ruin Christmas and tries to get the star on top of the tree, and would do whatever it takes to actually get it. But in the end, he becomes just straight up a good character and gets redeemed for his actions, which I don't exactly understand why that is, but for most of the entire special, he also comes off completely frisky to Marie, almost enough that he wants her to his own. And it just comes off completely disturbing throughout the entire special. There's scenes where he wants to kiss her, there's scenes where they kiss, there's scenes where he wants to just go up on her leg. If anything, it just comes off completely disturbing. It's not exactly something I would like to see, especially for a kid's film, quote-unquote. And I think his bad animation design, speaks for itself. Prince also doesn't have much to offer in this special as well, considering the fact that he actually is the Nutcracker, and then obviously the spell gets broken in the end. But honestly, he just kind of appears out of nowhere, especially when it came to the beginning of the movie, when they actually first have him introduced. Most of the time, it's just him just hanging around with all the characters, as the story just kind of excels. And even the relationship between him and Marie don't exactly really go anywhere. If anything, it just comes straight up flat, and doesn't exactly feel like it's very genuine. Which is funny to me, considering that the original Nutcracker story is pretty much the main importance of it is the main girl and the Nutcracker, and how their relationship is basically built at the end of the story. And here, it feels like their relationship's not exactly as genuine as what it's supposed to be, which is really insane to me. Overall, I think for most of what I explained about this entire movie for majority of this entire review, I really do not recommend this film. I do think that the Nuttiest Nutcracker is up there as one of the worst Christmas specials I've ever seen, probably even worse than Grandma Got Run Over a Reindeer, which is another review I actually did. To be honest with you, I think Grandma Got Run Over a Reindeer is actually a better film, because at least with that film, I actually can get something out of it. And at least it's somewhat had a setup, and at least self-aware to be how stupid it really is. But this film, you don't really get that. It just comes off completely cringe. It's just a really, really bad film, and it's just straight up just boring. It's not a film I honestly recommend anybody to really watch, especially for kids. Because I feel like with this kind of film, especially with all the sexual windows, and the puns, and everything about this film, I don't really think kids should really watch. But when it comes to like from an adult perspective, which obviously this is kind of what it's from, I honestly think that even for this special, even though I do think that if you're someone that really is very curious to watch this film, I mean, more power to you. I would recommend it just for the sake that you can actually get something out of it, or at least out of the curiosity factor. But honestly, in terms of how I feel about this movie, I do not recommend it, as I do think that It's definitely an adaptation that is loosely based from the Nutcracker, and honestly, I don't even think it even knows whether or not it actually is a film based on the Nutcracker. If anything, it feels more like a parody of the Nutcracker more so than the actual initial story. And also, it feels like it's much like a porno almost. Almost enough that you actually can be a little bit disturbed from just watching it. And in a way, that's kind of what I get out of this film for sure. So honestly, guys, I do not recommend the Nuttiest Nutcracker, and I really think that this is probably one of the worst specials I've ever seen. But anyway, guys, that's our review on the film. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.